The Common Ground program holds educational webinars and events about conservation issues like water conservation and quality, clean energy, soil health, and pollinators. We focus on educating the public and preserving Nebraska's natural legacy. During the presentation, if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A option at the bottom of the screen, or place it in the chat option to make sure to direct your questions to all panelists and attendees. And then once the webinar is done and you leave, a tab will open on your web browsers with a survey that we would love for you to complete. This helps us measure outreach and is used for grant reporting purposes. But today we have our speaker, Heidi Swanson, from as a Game and Parks naturalist. Heidi has always enjoyed learning about the natural world. She's worked as a technician for the Nature Conservancy, the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, and the Fish and Wildlife Service, while volunteering at DeSoto National Wildlife Refuge and Audubon's Roe Sanctuary. She realized that it was even better to share what she learned with other people, and she returned for a second year at Lake McConaughey and Ash Hollow as a park naturalist. Her other interests include reading fantasy and science fiction, and watching anime and playing video games. She will happily geek out with fans of the same. And thank you, Heidi, for speaking with us today. So I'll let you take it over.
All right, well, thanks for having me again, Alicia. It's good to be talking to people again. This year's obviously been a weird year, and I haven't been able to do a whole lot of programming, and I miss it. I miss talking about cool stuff and showing people things and learning stuff from them. So thanks again for being here. Today we're going to talk about Nebraska wetlands and why they're important as habitat, and some of the different kinds of wetlands we have, the different threats that they face, and what we can try to do to mitigate those. And then at the end, I've got some different links for more information, or if there's ways that you want to get involved with conservation, things like that. So first, I think I will start with a PowerPoint. All right, I've got two PowerPoints, but the first one is going to be, let's see if I can find it, here we go. Lindsay Rogers with Game and Parks actually did this one, but it's really well done, so I'm going to go ahead and use it. I just wanted to let you guys know that I didn't put this one together. I'm not taking credit for it. Is that showing up okay? Must be.
Yeah.
Just checking. So to start out with, in case you don't know, what is a wetland? The definition that we use is the same as the federal one, and the long wordy version is those areas that are inundated or saturated by surface or groundwater at a frequency and duration sufficient to support, and that under normal circumstances do support, a prevalence of vegetation typically adapted for life in saturated soils. Which basically just means there's a lot of water at some point, and you're going to find plants there that are adapted to growing in soggy soils, basically. So we've got three different characteristics for wetlands. The first one you'd notice is going to be the vegetation. You know, things like cattails and stuff are a dead giveaway. But there are some others. Hydric soils. What kind of dirt is there? Because if you have it submerged with water quite a bit, it's going to kind of change some things. And then, of course, the hydrology, or what sort of water is there, how long it's there, how the water is fed, if it's groundwater and such. We'll go into a little bit more detail for each of those, just so we kind of have a good baseline. The vegetation, like we talked about, water-loving plants. With the saturated soils, there's going to be less oxygen available, which is why these plants are adapted to thrive in these conditions. Swamp milkweed over here is one of my favorites. Cattails and bulrush. Arrowhead, lots of smartweed, get some water lily. There's lots of other kinds, depending on what sort of wetland we're talking about. The hydric soils, there's two types, and I think I'm pronouncing this one right, glade and organic. Those glade soils, which I keep wanting to call grade soils because they are a gray color, inorganic soils and anaerobic conditions. So there's a reduction of iron. You get this kind of gray color instead. To me, it looks just like your usual swamp mud sort of thing. The organic soils are cool. So you get a lot of vegetation, but when it dies off, it's not really able to be broken down or decomposed. So you get that buildup, and that's where you get peat or those bog formations. And we do, I think, I'd have to look it up, do have a few bogs or such in Nebraska, which I was surprised to learn about. The last thing is hydrology, just how the water behaves. Sometimes you'll have ones that are waterlogged basically year round. It might be the edge of a lake or rivers. Some might be even for as little as 1 month. You get those ephemeral wetlands, maybe something just after like a strong rain, or say like the Platte River where the water level varies a lot, sometimes in a short period of time. And those different characteristics lead to different plant and animal communities. And those ephemeral wetlands are especially important for amphibians because they have to lay their eggs in water. And with it being ephemeral or short-lived, it's not going to have fish and other predators in there that would eat the eggs and the tadpoles. So those are especially important. A couple really quick graphs so you can kind of visualize how these work. A lot of them are groundwater influenced. So you've got that depression in the ground that goes below the water table. And so that water seeps in, and it's going to be longer lived because that groundwater is pretty much always there. Even though you get some evaporation, it's still going to keep filling up. And then a similar one, just more on a slope instead of a depression, but you'll still get kind of some emergent vegetation there. And then there's when it's the wetland is above the water table, like you might find something along the edge of the lake. The water table rises here a bit because it's being recharged by the lake. And so you still get a little bit of wetland areas around the edges. But of course, as the lake level goes down, then wetland is going to shrink. And then some of the depressions, this would be more of like the high rain events. Or maybe if there was a clay bottom, it would catch the water, but it would eventually evaporate out. There's lots of different reasons that wetlands are important. Obviously, the one we're going to talk about today is mostly wildlife habitat, but they also act as filters to improve water quality. They can act as a sponge to reduce flooding, kind of soak up that extra water. The plant roots will help prevent the soil erosion. We kind of mentioned about the recharging the groundwater, producing food, both for a lot of animals that we'll talk about later, and also us, if anybody likes to duck hunt. And then of course, recreation and education opportunities. So if anybody ever tells you something like they're just sources of mosquitoes, you can tell them that there's a lot more going on than just that. Are there any questions so far? I haven't really been looking at the chat. Yeah, we'll be talking about some of the animals and stuff that live in the wetlands, or at least a few examples, because there's a lot of different kinds of wetlands, and so I won't be able to, I don't even know everything that lives in all of them. Here in Nebraska, we've got 4 different types of wetlands: the Playa lakes or Playa wetlands, sandhills wetlands, saline wetlands, and riparian. And this map kind of gives you an idea of where you'd find those. Now, this isn't supposed to represent this whole thing being a wetland. This is our yellow chunk here is the sandhills. That's where those are going to be found. The saline ones, or the salty ones, are over here in Lancaster County. Those have some pretty cool critters in it. Riverine, of course, is going to be a lot of it's along the Platte. And then our sandhills, and then the Playas. You might be most familiar with the Rainwater Basin down in here, but there's a number of other locations, and it's mostly a southern Nebraska thing. Now these are the ones that have that clay bottom, so they will catch that water and it doesn't seep into and disappear in the ground. And they're fairly circular, they're kind of scoured out by the wind. And you can see a lot of the surrounding areas, often cropland. Rainwater Basin's the main one I know about. There's also the Central Table Playas, and then ones in the Southwest, and then Todd Valley. And you'll probably find quite a few shorebirds along this one because you're not going to see a whole lot of vegetation around the edge for some of these. So there's plenty of mud flats and things like for sandpipers and shorebirds to go digging around in there, you know, looking for those invertebrates and stuff. And the ducks are really enjoying those. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. One of my personal favorite kinds are the Sandhills wetlands. I worked up in the Sandhills at Crescent Lake National Wildlife Refuge for a few summers, and it was just a treat to come over the hill, and then you've got this, you know, wet meadow, this dark green grass. You might have these open little marshy lake areas between the green grass and the blue sky and water. It was just so pretty, but also full of mosquitoes. That's just kind of how it goes. These are fed by groundwater, our own Ogallala aquifer. And what's neat about these, or one of the neat things, is kind of over on the west end of the Sandhills, you get some highly alkaline wetlands. And that has some really interesting characteristics to it as well. You'll get different little critters living in it, ones that are adapted to those conditions. I'm not as familiar with those though. The saline ones, where we don't have too many. So saline means salty. That's the groundwater goes through some bedrock, again, which has salts in it. And then as that water evaporates, that salt is left on the surface. And it looks pretty distinctive, and you find some really cool things out there, like the Salt Creek tiger beetle. And I've got a picture of that in my other presentation. But these are, I've got to go explore these. There's some really neat areas that kind of reminds me of the alkali flats up in North Dakota, where I was working with piping plovers. Kind of had that white crusty look to it. And that was, again, good for the macroinvertebrates, the little insects and stuff that they were going after for food. The most familiar ones are probably these riparian wetlands along the rivers. You can see they're usually, you know, full of cattails. You might find a lot of muskrats in there, maybe a beaver dam. There's one not too far from me on the North Platte. I always try to look for ducks or herons or muskrats or anything like that when I cross the bridge. That was a really kind of quick overview of some of the wetlands that we have here in Nebraska. Before I hop into my other PowerPoint with more pictures, does anybody have any questions or comments on that? I know we ran through it pretty quick. Mosquitoes can be a problem, obviously with West Nile. That's one of the big concerns. I usually end up using a fair bit of DEET if I have to go out there, between that and the ticks and the biting flies, which may or may not care about your bug spray at all. Yeah, it's definitely a health concern, but mosquitoes aren't all bad. They're a major food source for a lot of animals. So it's important to remember that they do have a very important place in the food web, even if they can be really inconvenient for us. The sandhills, yeah, are in the, up in that sandhills area, kind of our north central. A lot of the sandhills are more grass covered, so you don't always realize what it is you're looking at. And let's see. I don't have any recent pictures of those. I'd have to dig out in some of my old photo albums for that. Any other questions? Otherwise, I'll kind of zip into my other PowerPoint where I've got some different examples of the different critters and stuff that you can get there. All right, let's start that one. Come on, Zoom. All right, so a little bit more detail as to why they're so important as habitat. They are one of the most biologically productive ecosystems in the world, and part of that, I think, is due to just the sheer variability that they have. There's so many different types. Well, we talked about some of the different types that just we have for wetlands, but then depending on like how much water is there and different things, you get a lot of different species in there. And there's also so many different sources of food and such that you get high numbers of those populations as well. And it's, in a way, it's kind of an edge habitat between the aquatic and some of the upland or shrubby stuff. And you often find the largest numbers of species on the edge just because it's kind of a transition zone. So you get mixes of both. It's kind of the overlap in the Venn diagram. Water, of course, is the big thing because everything needs water to survive. And how the water behaves basically influences everything else. We talked about how it changes how the soil's made, which has an effect on what kind of plants can grow there, which will have an effect on the different animals that can live there. So it just kind of has a domino effect. And it can even vary year to year. You've got more of the aquatics down here. If it floods up high enough, then that emergent stuff like cattails and stuff will die back because they will kind of drown. If it lowers down, then you'll get more of the woody plants coming in. You might get a lot more grass along the shoreline, different things. So there's a lot of variations there. And of course, even if the water has a lot of salt or different minerals, things like that will also influence it as well. They have a lot of different varieties of shelter, and I think that has a pretty big impact on the animals that can live there. Depending on what kind of critter we're talking about and what the predator is, there's a lot of different options to escape all the things that are trying to eat you. You could dive underwater maybe to escape some of the air or land predators if they can't swim. If you're in the water, you might be able to climb like up the cattails or go on shore to escape some large fish or maybe the snapping turtles. You might even be able to hide down in the mud the way some frogs and turtles do, or even kind of among the water plants. If you've ever tried to look for an American bittern standing out in the cattails, even though you can hear it, they blend in very, very well. So there's a lot of different options for critters to hide, but there's still plenty of predation to go around. There's and on here you can kind of see what my biases are. I know a lot more about birds and such than I do about, like, say, the kinds of fish that you might find in there or some of the plants. That's not my strong point, so that got a little vague. But duckweed is a big producer. Cattails, there's a lot of plants there that produce a lot of seeds, which is really important for migratory ducks and geese. All those annoying insects that I often don't like are also food for a lot of things, even those nasty mosquito larvae that are everywhere in the pond out back behind my place. Turtles and snakes, obviously we get a lot of the amphibians here because they have to have the wetlands here. Without wetlands, you're not really going to have amphibians. Different birds, whether they're eating fish or eating the bugs that are there. And then you get up into the mammals between the mink or muskrats and the beavers who could make their own wetland even. So there's a lot of different things going on here, a lot of different possibilities for wildlife. And as an example, using Rainwater Basin of why they're so important, even to animals that don't live there full time, like our migratory waterfowl. For just 1 year, there's an estimated 7 to 9 million ducks and 2 to 3 million geese that come through there and use the Rainwater Basin wetlands every year. And about half of the mallards that come through here, about a third of the pintails, and almost all of the white-fronted geese. And you remember from those pictures how a lot of them in the Rainwater Basin were surrounded by cropland and such. So habitat loss is also a concern. I mean, we've really got to be careful in how we're changing the environment too, because it can have a massive impact on things. Why do I always bringing up the chat? Oh, well. You try it again while you can look at some pictures. Nope, doesn't want to. Okay. Alicia, since I can't see the chat, were there some other questions in there for now, or am I running too fast through things?
There's a couple questions. So Ryan wants to know what rats live in swamps. There are rats.
The closest one I can, it's not really close, but muskrats at least, you know, kind of look like rats. And rats are in general are pretty generalistic. They can live in a lot of different places and eat a lot of different things. I'm not sure how common they are in wetlands, unless you're talking about the rodents of unusual size out in the fire swamp. But
yeah. And then he also asked what frogs live in swamps.
Ooh, frogs. The ones I can always think of are like the leopard frogs. You get ones like spring peepers, which will be singing quite a bit, or chorus frogs. Let's see, cricket frogs, and I always think of them as click-it frogs because somebody told me they sound like when you click two marbles together, and that is really what they sound like. So that's like one of the few frogs I can recognize by sound. You might also find quite a few bullfrogs, especially out here at Ash Hollow at Spring Pond. A couple weeks ago when I was walking out there, I swear there was a frog like about every 3 feet. And some of them were really big. And then some of them were only about like that. And bullfrogs are interesting because they're not really native to this area. From what I was reading, they were brought in the early 1800s, I think, as a food source, actually. Frog legs, right?
Oh, yeah.
And they can, they basically eat anything that will fit into their mouth. And I mean anything. I've seen videos of them going after like a sparrow that landed on the shoreline, baby ducks, other frogs, like anything goes in there, which is, convenient for the bullfrogs, but it really takes a toll on the other wildlife that are in that wetland. So I got mixed feelings about bullfrogs. They're really cool, but they can kind of be a problem.
Right, yeah. And then Ryan also wants to know, how do wetlands form?
It does depend on the kind of wetland. Some of them, like the sandhills, we've got our aquifer there, so it's kind of you can kind of think of it as an underground lake. There's a lot of water, Sometimes it's only a few feet down. Sometimes it's, you know, tens to hundreds of feet down. And then we've got this sand, and if there's a bit of a depression there, if it's whether a blowout or sand or just, you know, a hollow between the two hills, if it dips down below that water line, you're going to have that water kind of seeping in. If you've ever gone to a lake shore or even here at Lake McConaughey and go digging in the sand by the edge of the lake, eventually you're going to come down to the water level and your hole is going to fill up with water. That's kind of like the sandhills wetlands. Some of the others like riparian or along the rivers, that's basically, the Platt's a good example since it's kind of flat and really wide. It doesn't usually have very steep banks. So you get a lot of areas with really shallow water, and it's also really close to the water table here too. So there's very soggy soils, which leads to those wetland plants that we talked about. Let's see, the playas, those have a clay bottom. So with, like, say, high rainfall or something, there's nowhere for the water to go. It kind of catches it like a little bowl. So there's a lot of different ways wetlands can form. It might be if a lake is kind of drying up or different things like that. Old oxbows, like if the river changes course, like some of those old river channels and stuff will basically be wetlands now instead of part of the river. So there's a lot of different ways that you can get a wetland.
And then his last question, what bugs?
What bugs? That's another thing I'm not real good at. I've got some books on it. Let's see. Obviously, mosquitoes are a big thing. There's larvae and adults around there that you'd find for lots of different species of beetles. Dragonflies actually start out in water. The dragonfly larva, I don't have a picture of it now, but they're also predators. They've got big pincers in front, and they'll go around and eat like some of the mosquito larvae and everything else. And then when they hatch and climb out of the water, when they molt, excuse me, and then they will basically chase after the adult mosquitoes as well. You'll find a lot of flies around there. Midges, like little gnats sort of things, little biting flies. Let's see, what else have I seen? There's plenty of spiders, even though they're not insects, but lots of different spiders too. There's a fishing spider that will actually go down after minnows. There's a kind of spider that carries an air bubble down with it, like a diving bell. It's really cool.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So that's all the questions for now, if you want to.
Yep. I'll continue on with this. Those are some good questions, though. I like that. Another big reason why wetlands are important are that in Nebraska, 70% of our threatened and endangered species rely on wetlands at least some point during their life cycle. Whether it's where they come to lay their eggs, like the piping plovers and least terns, they're going to be on the sandbars, especially in the Platte River, where we have sandbars now, and on the beaches, going after more of those little insects. The pallid sturgeon, it likes kind of slow-moving backwater sort of areas, and they grow very slowly. That Salt Creek tiger beetle right here, one of those insects I really like. That's, again, out in the salt flats in Lancaster County. And my favorite fact about them is, so these are beetles that eat other bugs. They're carnivorous, and they run really, really fast to go catch them. And they hunt by sight with vision, but for their size, they run so fast that they run faster than they can see. As they run, they're basically blind and they can't see where they are yet until they stop. I kind of think of it like they're going warp speed practically. It's just really weird to think about. and I'm not entirely sure how that works. This little funny looking plant here is saltwort. Sometimes it's also in those salt flats, and sometimes that's the only plant you're going to see out there. It's actually a succulent, and it's got these really thin kind of scale leaves folded around the stem. You just can't really see it unless you get right up into it. And then these two little fish over here, the northern red belly and fine scale dace, little neat nose, but I found out these guys are special because they live in cold water, cold springs. We've got different populations of them out in the sandhills, but the main population of these minnows, these little fish, are like hundreds of miles north of us, like up into like Canada and even up in the Yukon. And how they got down here, I think, was when the glaciers were moving down, then these fish were able to live in that kind of cold water, that's melting off of it, so kind of in front of the glaciers. And then as the glaciers receded, they were cut off from the rest of their population. But we have a number of basically cold water springs or water seeps with that aquifer. And so they're able to survive in some of our small streams and that. But obviously they're very fragile populations since they're cut off from most of the other fish. And it's a very specific habitat that they can inhabit here. So I'm not sure how long we'll be able to protect them, but it was a neat little story with those fish. I never would have thought of something like that living out here. We talked about why wetlands are important and some of the animals that live there, but obviously there is some problems. One of the main things are going to be invasive species. And there's different plants that cause problems, like the Phragmites here in the bottom corners, a grass. We have a native Phragmites, but this one, I thought it was from Australia. I think they brought it in like for erosion control because it will form eventually a very dense stand. Like all you'll have is the Phragmites, and they've got a very like interlocking rhizomous root system. So it is good for erosion control, but then you aren't able to have anything else growing there. Nothing will fit. So it reduces the types of plants that can grow there, which is going to reduce the kinds of animals that can grow there. And a lot of animals and stuff, or even people with boats, cannot get through this. So it kind of forms its own little blockade. This brittle naiad does something similar, and it breaks apart so easily, and then new plants can kind of grow from those little bits, and so it spreads really fast. You might have heard of our zebra and quagga mussels that, cross your fingers, we aren't going to get in Lake McConaughey anytime soon. But they've caused problems in other areas because, like these other critters, they don't really have any predators to properly keep them in check. And so you get these really big populations, and they will outcompete a lot of our native clams and other bivalves and eat up all the food. And that's a lot of like what the silver carp do. They'll kind of hoover up everything that they come across, which leaves less food for our own native fish. And of course, these guys like to jump out and slap you in the face if you drive by in a boat. So they're a human hazard too. Yeah, lots of different problems. And I got these pictures from Nebraska Invasive Species, and I've got a link for that coming up because there's a lot of good information there about how to recognize these invasive species, what you can do about it to try to manage it, or just at least report sightings so we know where they are and where we can go deal with that. Another good one is stopaquatichitchhikers.org, like for those quagga and zebra mussels. And the short version to deal with those is a clean drain and dry your boat or other water equipment in between uses, in between bodies of water. You know, just make sure you aren't taking things from place to place. So those are both really very useful websites that I would recommend for more information on different invasive species. Another big threat, of course, is habitat loss, like for pretty much all habitats. The main thing that happens to our wetlands is drainage and development. A lot of it's converted to cropland. I mean, we're basically the breadbasket of the nation. You know, we grow a lot of different crops, and that's led to us losing more than a third of our wetlands in the last 125 years. We've been able to slow that down quite a bit, but it's a delicate balance between farming and getting enough food and such, like for humans, while also leaving enough habitat for wildlife, and also making sure that our people can actually afford to farm, basically. It can get kind of complicated. Some of the things folks can do about that, assuming they might be landowners, different CRP programs. I've got some links down here for different habitat programs, like for Pheasants Forever. And I know they mostly focus on like upland birds, pheasants and stuff, but that's other wetland projects as well. And then this big, long, kind of ugly looking link takes you to the USDA, which does a lot of wetland work, both just helping landowners out financially or just trying to plan how to protect or conserve or even create a new wetland, depending on what you need. And for people like me who don't have land, we can always just buy the duck stamp, because 90% of that money goes to habitat preservation and restoration. That's like the most efficient way, money-wise, that you can help out for wetland habitat. And plus, they've got really pretty artwork, and there's a new one out every year, so you can start collecting them if you want to. They're just great. I love the duck stamps. There are other ways to get involved as well. I really liked learning about the Nebraska Natural Legacy Project. They've done basically a survey and inventory of all the different kinds of habitats that we have in Nebraska, including wetlands, and the different threatened species that are present there, the different threats and stuff to each habitat, you know, what we can do. There's a lot of information in there. And they also do projects with landowners and partnerships with other people to protect habitat and things. And you can contact Melissa Pinella for that. And part of this is going to be on a link I've got on the next page or two, and I'll share that page with you online as well. One of my personal favorites, tern and plover, because I love my piping plovers. I've worked with them for 2 summers, and they're one of my favorite birds. And with all the changes we've made to the Platte River and its associated wetlands, it's really done a number on them as well. So that's something that's near and dear to me. Fish and Wildlife also has a kind of Nebraska chapter, so you can go here and talk to them again about getting, you know, information or where to start, things like that. So there's a lot of different resources that you can go to for help, or where I would go to try to figure some of this stuff out. You could also just donate to a conservation organization like Nebraska Wildlife Conservation Fund, who does a lot of the research needed to come up with different habitat protection plans and help care for things, and also do different programs kind of like what I'm doing today to help basically get the word out about what we have and how we need to protect it. Another simple, not so simple, it depends, just conserving the natural resources as best we can as individuals. You know, just things like turning off the lights, recycling, using less water, just trying to lessen our own impact on the earth. I mean, because there's a lot of people. We have a pretty big impact. And a lot of times all we can really control is what we personally do. So there's a few different steps that we can take that will benefit not just wetlands, of course, but all of our natural resources. So always keep that sort of thing in mind. And I'm going to see if I can share this link here after I'm done. There's a lot of good information on here, along with some really good free downloads. There's the Guide to Nebraska Wetlands, which is, God, I wanted to say it was at least 60 pages or so long, and goes into great detail about everything that we have available. There's also a link on this page that I'll show you where you can get a paper copy for free if you don't want to download it. Like if me, who have, you know, terrible internet, it would take 4 days probably. You can also get the 2019 Wetland Program Plan. That was the most recent one I saw, so you can kind of get up to date on what we're doing. And that website also has a nice little video if you'd want to check that out in your free time. It's about half an hour and also goes through wetlands and their importance as habitat. And it's something that Game and Parks and NET put together. And it's aimed mostly toward like 4th, 6th grade, but there's a lot of good information in there anyways. And a lot of information I also found from UNL. I get a lot of information from University of Nebraska, so they've got a lot of good stuff too. So there's, yeah, that's a pretty good handful of links to get you guys started if you want to learn more about the wetlands we have in Nebraska. And I think I probably ran through that fairly quick. Oh, no. I just talked a lot. These are some pictures I took from the wetlands out around here. And I just want to thank you guys for caring about our wetlands and sticking around to learn about them. There's some cool ways that you guys can learn about them too. Over here on this side, it was one of our freshwater exploration. So we just had some white tubs, a couple ice cube trays, some nets, and we basically, you know, went out to one of the wetlands, kind of swish the net around, get it into these tubs of water, and just see what you can find. We had some little crawdads in there, and this little weirdo, I think, turned out to be a larva for a giant mayfly. I don't know. That was one of the coolest things we had. And different wetlands that I've seen this fall. Let me pull up one of those websites quick just to show you, and then I will see if there's anything else you'd like to know. Let me find that. Again, I know I threw a whole lot of information at you, so I appreciate you guys sticking around for that. Okay. This is probably one of the best places to start, I think. Here's that guide to Nebraska's wetlands. A quick infographic on why they're so important. That wetland program plan, outreach education, other resources, just all sorts. And then here's that cool little video I was telling you guys about. So if you folks were gonna start anywhere to learn more about our wetlands, I'd probably go here to outdoornebraska.gov, Nebraska wetlands, and go from there. Are there any other questions in the chat? I think I've missed those too.
There was one about predators in wetlands. Are there a lot of predators in wetlands?
Oh yes, lots of different food sources. You're gonna have a lot of different predators. Snapping turtles, one of my favorites. Different kinds of snakes, whether it's maybe just garter snakes or we've got some water snakes here in Nebraska. They're not poisonous, but they're around. Let's see. Mink are a cool one. They'll be going after fish and different things. Great blue herons could be going after frogs or snakes or fish. You might get some, let's see, maybe some gulls or some birds of prey that would go after maybe some of the ducklings or little shorebirds that you might find there. You probably get some, foxes or coyotes coming around, or raccoons and such to go after some of the bird eggs. And then of course there's plenty of fish that would eat other fish. You could even say the dragonflies, both the larvae and the adults, are predators. So yeah, there's a lot of different kinds. Something's always eating something else.
Good to know. We have a couple other ones from Danae. To what animals are mosquitoes a food source?
Swallows. Birds are usually the first thing I would think of. Cliff swallows, barn swallows, they're going after those flying insects, a lot of which are going to be mosquitoes. Bats are another good one. They'll be eating, mosquitoes and moths and different things. Dragonflies will eat mosquitoes. And those are the ones I always think of offhand. Spiders would, as long as they get it in their spider web, different things like that. Maybe some smaller frogs, some fish probably would, if they happen to land on or near the surface. So those are the ones that I can think of right offhand, but it wouldn't surprise me if there's more.
Yeah. And then Ray wanted to know, what wildlife encounter have you had that was the most exciting for you and why?
Most exciting. Kind of depends on how you define exciting, but there's a couple that kind of got my heart pounding for different reasons. One of the most recent ones, I had a rattlesnake out behind my house about a month and a half ago. And I'm glad I noticed it in time, because the little jerk didn't rattle its tail or move or anything. I was just walking down to turn the sprinklers on and then stopped, because 2 steps away was that snake. So I had me a moment for a while. And then I just backed off and watched it for 15 minutes until it took off. But that's the only time I saw it. I don't know where it went. But I've been, stomping around since then with no trouble, but definitely gave me a heart attack at the time. But it was also pretty cool, because that's the first time I've really got to see a live one up close that wasn't behind glass or something. So that was pretty cool. I had to go get my binoculars out so I could go look at it. Another exciting one was a couple years ago when I worked for up at Crescent Lake. We were catching snapping turtles and putting ID tags on them. So that was interesting. We were going out in the airboat, and this was late in the summer. They were all kind of up near the surface sunning, so you kind of look for the big round thing in the lake, and we'd get up next to it with the airboat, and we had these long, nets, and you got to scoop it up without falling into the lake and drag them onto the boat. And then I got to try to hold on to them so Marlon could drill the ID tag into the edge of the shell. And that was, that was exciting too in its own way. I had a lot of trouble trying to get those things to hold still. Oh my God. Didn't get bit, but that's close. So lots of different things, mostly from my field work days, which I do kind of miss, but it's also been a lot of fun just, telling people the cool stories and hearing the stuff that they know too.
Right, yeah. And then Ryan says, who discovered the first wetland, if you know?
Oh God, I have no idea.
Yeah.
I'm trying to dig into some of my history knowledge. I would assume, well, I guess it depends by who and discovered, because let's see. I guess civilization started in the Fertile Crescent, if I'm remembering my history right, which was in between 2 or 3 rivers. And so there were definitely wetlands associated with that. I could not tell you how many years ago that would have been, but humans would have come across it fairly quickly. I mean, there's so many different kinds of wetlands. So there's always one pretty much not too far from you at any given point. It just depends on what kind.
Yeah.
Interesting thought though.
Yeah. But that looks like all the questions we have right now.
Right. I'm gonna quit screen sharing for the moment.
Yeah, but thank you again, Heidi, for speaking with us about wetlands. Learned a lot that I didn't know about them, and yeah.
I learned a lot just by looking up some of this too, so that's always fun.
Yeah. And then just a reminder to everybody, when you exit the webinar, it will pop up a survey, and if you could please take that survey, that'd be great. Thank you, guys.
Thanks for hanging out with us today, folks. I really appreciate it.